I want to tell you a story that happened to me. My name is Adela, and I want to tell you something that happened to me 7 years ago. This is the story of how I went from being fired for supposedly lacking leadership qualities to discovering I was actually the majority owner of the company that dismissed me. It's about patience, preparation, and the power of quiet strength in a world that often mistakes volume for authority. Let me take you back to that day when everything changed. I was halfway through reviewing our quarterly sales data when Martin stormed into my office. No knock, no courtesy, just a loud, deliberate entrance designed to rattle me. That was typical Martin behavior. Elena, he barked, tossing a file onto my desk. We need to talk. Now. I glanced at the folder, then at the man I'd worked under for the last 4 years. Martin Ree was the kind of man who never looked twice at women in the office unless he needed coffee or someone to organize his calendar. He liked power, and more than that, he liked reminding others that he had it. Still, I stayed calm. I always did. Of course, I replied, gesturing to the chair across from me. He didn't sit. Instead, he loomed over my desk with that practiced intimidation he'd perfected over the years. The board has decided to restructure the leadership team. We're moving in a different direction. And frankly, we need people who can lead, not just follow spreadsheets. I blinked, stunned for just half a second. You're firing me? He smirked like he'd just sunk a game-winning shot. Let's not be dramatic. We're releasing you from your position, effective immediately. No warning, no performance review, and certainly no recognition for the fact that my department had just delivered the highest revenue growth in 3 years. The irony was bitter and immediate. I see, I said quietly. May I ask why? His tone was clipped, rehearsed. You lack vision. You manage tasks, not people. And let's be honest, this industry needs strong leadership, assertiveness, confidence. Traits you haven't exactly demonstrated. There it was. Not even veiled a dig at my gender wrapped in buzzwords and corporate fluff. He didn't see me as a leader, not because I hadn't delivered results, but because I didn't fit his outdated mold of what leadership looked like. I understand, I said, my voice steady and neutral. Martin narrowed his eyes, clearly thrown off by my composure. He'd expected outrage, maybe even tears, but I'd learned long ago how to control my emotions. In boardrooms full of egos, I'll need your badge and company laptop by the end of the day, he added. HR will disable your access by 5 p.m. They have your severance details. I nodded and stood, extending my hand. Thank you, Martin. I appreciate the clarity. He hesitated, but shook my hand. Good luck out there. As he turned and walked out, satisfied with his little coup, I sat back down and exhaled slowly. My hands didn't shake. My breath didn't quicken. In fact, I felt lighter, because what Martin didn't know, what no one in that building knew, was that I wasn't just a department head. 2 weeks ago, something had changed, something big, and I had been waiting for the right moment to use it. I glanced at the framed photo on my desk. My father, smiling proudly at a ribbon-cutting ceremony from the day he opened the company's first regional office. The same company Martin had just released me from. You told me to wait, Dad, I whispered, running my fingers along the edge of the frame. Wait until the time was right. I stood and began packing my things. I didn't take much, just a few personal items, a mug my team had given me last Christmas, and a stack of old notebooks filled with ideas that had never made it past Martin's desk. Outside my office, the workplace buzzed with quiet curiosity. A few coworkers gave me sympathetic glances, others avoided eye contact. No one asked questions, but I saw the thoughts on their faces. Did she get fired? What did she do wrong? I left the building with a small, polite smile and no fanfare. As I stepped into the sunlight, I felt the weight of 15 years inside that company slip off my shoulders. They thought they'd ended my career, but what they'd actually done was give me the green light. I reached for my phone and texted a single message to my lawyer. It's time. Prepare everything. The reply came back almost instantly. Understood. Shareholder meeting can be scheduled within 5 business days. I looked back at the glass building glinting in the sun. Martin thought this was over, but he had no idea what was coming. The next time I walked into that boardroom, it wouldn't be as an employee. It would be as their majority shareholder, and the smile I wore that day would be real. 2 weeks earlier, I had sat in the quiet, wood-paneled office of my family's attorney, staring at a document I wasn't allowed to open until the clock struck noon on my 30th birthday. My father had always loved theatrics. He said it made serious things feel significant, and this apparently was one of them. Elena, Mr. Harrington, our longtime family lawyer, had said, with a warm, fatherly tone, your father left very clear instructions. You're not to open this envelope until your 30th birthday. Not a day before. I had smiled politely, half curious, half amused. What is it? Some kind of delayed birthday card? He gave me a look that told me he knew something I didn't, and that he wasn't about to spoil the surprise. Your father was a man of vision, he said instead, and he trusted you more than anyone. That sentence stayed with me in the days that followed. My father, the founder and former CEO of the very company that had just let me go without ceremony, had always believed in foresight, in planning ahead, and he had believed in me. When he passed away 5 years ago, the company had changed. It became colder, more calculated, less about the people and more about the numbers. Martin had joined shortly after, charming the board with his MBA credentials and slowly dismantling the culture my father had built. I'd stayed, thinking I could protect what remained of his legacy. But now I realized my father had known something like this might happen, and he'd prepared for it. On the morning of my birthday, I opened the envelope alone, sitting in the same spot where my father used to read the paper every Sunday morning, sunlight streaming through the window, a quiet warmth in the air. Inside was a letter and a formal document with embossed seals. I unfolded the letter first. It was handwritten in my father's neat script. Elena, if you're reading this, you've turned 30, and that means you're ready. I never doubted it. Not for a second. You've spent your life working twice as hard for half the recognition. I saw it, even when you thought I didn't. I saw the sacrifices, the late nights, the integrity. No one else noticed. I also saw how the company changed after I left, and I knew there might come a time when you'd need more than a seat at the table. So I gave you the table. I paused, blinking hard, my hands trembling slightly as I turned to the document behind. The letter. It was a trust agreement filed and notarized. According to the trust, 90% of the company shares my father had retained when he stepped down had been placed under my name, held until I turned 30, with full voting rights activated. Immediately. 90%. I read it 3 times, then once more just to be sure I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't just a shareholder, I was the majority owner, the controlling shareholder. My entire body buzzed with disbelief, adrenaline, and something else, power. Quiet, measured, undeniable power. I called Mr. Harrington immediately. Is this real? I asked, barely able to get the words out. Yes. He replied simply, your father structured the trust to avoid public filings. It was airtight. The board has no idea unless you choose to tell them. Why didn't he activate it sooner? He wanted you to experience the company on your own, terms first, to see who would reveal themselves, to decide if you wanted it before you used it. That line hit me hard. I'd spent years being underestimated, overlooked, talked over in meetings. I'd watched Martin get praise for ideas I'd quietly suggested, watched male colleagues rise faster despite doing less. I'd smiled through it all, thinking patience and hard work would eventually pay off. Now I realized it hadn't been time. That was missing. It was leverage. And suddenly I had it. I scheduled a follow-up with Mr. Harrington for the next day. Let's talk about what comes next, I said. He didn't miss a beat. We'll prepare the documents to call for a shareholders meeting. We'll notify the board once everything's ready. Don't notify them yet, I said. Not until I give the word. There was a pause on the line. Elena, may I ask what you're planning? I looked out the window of my apartment, watching the traffic roll by, people rushing around, unaware that everything was about to change. I'm planning to walk into that boardroom, I said calmly, and show them exactly who they tried to fire. I didn't show up for the mandatory exit interview. HR called, twice, then emailed. I ignored them both. Instead, I sat in a downtown cafe, sipping coffee while Mr. Harrington reviewed the final draft of the shareholder meeting request. It was official now on paper. I held 90% of the company's voting power, a legal and financial reality Martin would never have seen coming. You sure you're ready? Harrington asked. Once you submit this, you'll be throwing a grenade into their boardroom. I looked him in the eye. They pulled the pin the moment they fired me. The documents were simple: a formal notice of a special shareholder meeting with a single agenda item, leadership review, and appointment of new executive management. Martin wouldn't be expecting it. His entire style was built on control through confidence, and the board had let him run unchecked for too long. I'll serve them notice Friday morning, Harrington continued. The meeting will be set for Tuesday. That afternoon, I sat down with Caroline Winters, the trustee who had managed the shares since my father's passing. Inside her folder was everything I'd need: ownership certificates, voting records, and a detailed summary of company performance under Martin's leadership. Declining employee satisfaction scores, rising turnover, overspending on executive perks, and flattening revenue despite a growing market. By Monday, rumors about my sudden disappearance had spread. I got texts from former colleagues asking what happened, but I didn't respond. The silence was part of the plan. I wanted Martin confident, certain he'd erase me from the story. That evening, I stood in front of my mirror, trying on the navy suit I'd bought for special occasions but never worn. It was sharp, tailored, clean, the kind of outfit you wear when you walk into a room not to ask for power, but to own it. I practiced what I'd say, not a speech, just a few lines. Precise, measured, undeniable. The truth would do most of the work for me. Tuesday morning arrived crisp and cool. The city bustled as usual, unaware that inside one boardroom everything was about to change. I arrived 10 minutes early, walking past the receptionist with quiet confidence. She did a double take but didn't stop me. Upstairs, the boardroom lights were already on. I could see movement through the frosted glass. Mr. Harrington met me by the elevators, his expression unreadable but calm. "They're in there," he said. "Martin's already speaking. He thinks this is just another quarterly strategy review." "Not for long," I replied. I took a slow breath, smoothed the front of my jacket, and stepped forward. The door to the boardroom opened with a soft click. Heads turned, conversation stilled, and Martin mid-sentence froze when he saw me. "Elena," he said, eyebrows arching, "this meeting is for board members only." I smiled politely, setting the ownership documents on the table. "Exactly." Then I took my seat at the head of the table. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Martin stared at me from the far end of the long oak table, confusion flickering across his face, followed by disbelief. I could practically see the gears turning in his head, trying to place me back in the box he thought he'd locked me in last week. "Elena," he said again, voice sharp now, "this is a board meeting. As I already mentioned, employees are not permitted." "I'm not here as an employee," I said calmly. "I'm here as the majority shareholder." That one sentence shifted the entire energy of the room. Board members glanced at one another, some stiffening, others sitting forward with interest. One of them, Mr. Dalton, who had been with the company since my father's days, looked down at the document I'd placed in front of him, then back up at me with raised eyebrows. "Is this accurate?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. "It is," I replied. 90% of the company's shares were transferred to me through a family trust when I turned 30. All paperwork is in order, filed, notarized, and submitted in accordance with corporate governance. Martin looked from me to Mr. Harrington, who was calmly unfolding a copy of the ownership certificate and handing it to the board secretary. "You can't be serious," Martin scoffed, his voice rising. "This is absurd." "Why would your father?" "Because he trusted me," I interrupted, "and because he knew exactly what this company would become without oversight." The room was still again. Everyone knew what I meant, even if I didn't say it outright. Since my father's death, Martin had turned the culture toxic. He rewarded loyalty over competence, appearance over results, and the numbers had started to show it. "Let's get to the point," I continued, opening the second folder I'd brought. "As majority shareholder, I've called this special meeting to review the current executive leadership, including the position of Chief Executive Officer." Martin stood now, his face flushed. "This is a coup, a personal vendetta. You think you can waltz in here?" "I'm not asking," I said, finally raising my voice just enough to command the room. "I'm exercising my rights." Then I slid the financial report across the table. "Let's talk about performance." I didn't need theatrics. The numbers spoke for themselves. Employee satisfaction down 38% into years. Turnover in key departments up 47%. 3 active discrimination complaints under our review. Flat revenue growth in a market that was booming. I've compiled testimony from department heads, employee surveys, and financial audits, I said. I've also documented misuse of company funds, unauthorized travel, excessive executive bonuses, and misleading investor reports. I glanced at Martin. All signed off under your leadership. Board members began flipping through the pages. Mr. Dalton looked genuinely disturbed. The CFO, who had sat quietly until now, leaned over to whisper something to the general counsel, who immediately began typing on his tablet. Martin's jaw clenched. You're twisting data to make your little revenge fantasy look legitimate. I don't need to twist anything, I said. I have evidence. You relied on the assumption that no one powerful enough would ever question you. That assumption ends today. I let that hang in the air for a moment, then pulled out the final document. Effective immediately, I am submitting a motion to remove Martin Rhee as CEO of this company. As majority shareholder, my vote is sufficient to carry the motion. The board secretary looked stunned. You don't need a second vote? I own 90. I said simply. A majority by any definition, Mr. Dalton cleared his throat. In accordance with company bylaws, the motion stands effective upon completion of documentation. Martin slammed a hand on the table. You can't do this. I already did. Security didn't need to be called. Martin didn't resist, but as he stormed out, his face a twisted mix of rage and disbelief, I noticed something remarkable. He didn't look powerful anymore. He looked small. Once the door clicked shut behind him, I exhaled slowly and turned to face the rest of the board. This company deserves better, I said. So do its people. And starting today, that's exactly what they're going to get. Mr. Dalton nodded slowly, a faint smile forming. Welcome back, Elena. By the end of the week, Martin's nameplate had been removed from the CEO's office door. I didn't move into the office immediately. I didn't need the symbolism of a bigger desk to confirm my position. I had something more important to do first. Rebuild the soul of the company my father had started. The Monday following the shareholders' meeting, I called an all-hands staff meeting in the main conference hall, the same space where Martin had once paraded sales projections like war medals and handed out empty praise to the same handful of executives over and over again. But this time, the energy was different, curious, hesitant, hopeful. Employees filed in slowly, murmuring among themselves. The front rows were empty, as if no one wanted to seem too eager. Some looked nervous, others suspicious. They'd been burned before. I stood alone at the front of the room, holding no notes, no slides, just my truth. Some of you know me, I began. Some of you only know what you've been told. But let me start by saying this. I didn't come here to take power. I came here to restore trust. A few heads tilted. People were listening. For years, this company ran on the strength of its people, on your ideas, your late nights, your belief that what we were building mattered. And somewhere along the way, that got lost. I paused, letting the silence fill the room. I was fired last week, I said, smiling faintly. Told I wasn't what this company needed. That I lacked the leadership to take us into the future. A few people chuckled nervously at first, but the tension began to shift. My honesty was disarming them. I didn't fight back. Not then. Because I knew something Martin didn't. That leadership isn't about volume or vanity. It's about vision and respect and lifting the people who actually do the work. I looked out over the crowd, locking eyes with a few familiar faces. Engineers I'd worked alongside for years. Assistants who were always overlooked. Junior analysts who had been stuck under layers of corporate ego. Starting today, everything changes. Over the next 2 weeks, I did something radical. I listened. I met with department heads, team leads, interns, receptionists, custodial staff. I asked what wasn't working, what they needed, who deserved more recognition. And then I acted. I promoted Maya from customer service to head of client experience, a role she'd officially been doing while her manager took credit. I brought back Kevin, a brilliant developer who had resigned after being repeatedly passed over. I restructured HR entirely and launched the People First initiative, recognizing innovation and rewarding collaboration regardless of job title. Late one evening, walking the halls alone, I passed a whiteboard where someone had scrawled, "She came back, not she took over or she fired Martin. She came back." That mattered more than any title I now held. The following week, I finally moved into the CEO's office. Not because I needed the space, but because it was time. The nameplate was new, sleek, brushed steel, with simple, elegant lettering. Elena Wren, Chief Executive Officer. I didn't bring much with me. Just one framed photo, my father and me on the company's opening day, both smiling, both hopeful. I placed it on the corner of the desk and sat down, not with a sense of conquest, but of continuation. This wasn't just my company now, it was my responsibility, and I intended to honor it. It was exactly 1 year to the day since I'd been fired. When I sat in my office, reviewing the quarterly report, it was our strongest quarter in 5 years. Customer satisfaction up 23, employee retention up 41%, revenue breaking records. But what mattered more was how we did it: ethically, collaboratively, transparently. The company culture had shifted. People no longer whispered complaints over coffee, they spoke freely and were actually heard. Feedback loops were open. Diversity in leadership had doubled. We didn't just bring good people in. We finally gave them a place to grow. My father's legacy wasn't just in the business he built, but in the values he instilled and the foresight to ensure they would endure. Sometimes the most powerful leadership happens quietly, patiently, with the deep knowledge that the right moment will always come.